Hello and welcome to the Fireside Chat. I'm David Lipson.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, Donald Trump steps up his search for a VP, so who made the shortlist?
Not Mike Pence.
True.
Also, the backlash against Biden's new immigration policy. But first... Well, it's now 7 days since Trump New York jurors returned their guilty verdict, and it's only now that we're starting to get a better idea of the short-term beneficiary of that news. Polling site 538 averaged the 4 major polls conducted after the verdict, and they found the race to be tied. So that represents a 1-point move towards Biden since those polls' last pre-verdict results. So somehow things have gotten even tighter. The New York Times went one better though, and they actually spoke to exactly the same voters after the verdict that they spoke to before the verdict. And they found that the group favoured Trump by 3 points in April and in May, but then after the verdict, they only favoured Trump by 1 point, suggesting 2 points of movement towards Biden. Furthermore, they found that Trump retained about 93% of his voters from before the verdict. So where did that 7% go? Apparently 3% of Trump's previous supporters had gone back to Biden and 4% were now undecided. And that shift was particularly pronounced amongst the young, non-white, disengaged, ex-Democratic voters that Trump has won over recently. In fact, of the 2020 Biden voters that Trump had won over, he just lost a quarter of them right back to Biden after that verdict. Meanwhile, Republicans are starting to work out a way that they can express their displeasure with the verdict. This was Speaker Mike Johnson hinting at defunding Special Counsel Jack Smith.
We're going to look at Special Counsel Jack Smith, who we believe is abusing his authority as well. We have the funding streams, we have mechanisms to try to get control of that. We'll be doing that within the confines of our jurisdiction, and I think that can have the desired effect and show the American people we're not going to tolerate this.
Okay, now that was a subtle threat from Mike Johnson. Okay. Not nearly as subtle was House Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene, who never is subtle. She's expressed a plan to cut New York State off from federal funding in order to punish residents for what the jury did to Donald Trump. Less subtle. Now, that's obviously not going to be happening, but how legitimate do you think the Republicans' concerns are about the trial against Trump being overly political?
Well, look, overly political in the United States, it's America, right? Everything is overly political in my experience. But was this some sort of conspiracy to, by Joe Biden, by the Republicans, by the White House to go after Donald Trump through the courts? There is absolutely no evidence of that. But the other thing is, I guess, to a casual observer looking on at, the jury, the district that this happened, the history of the judge, the history of the district attorney, well, I'm sure they would have some questions.
Yeah, look, I feel like there's some I basically agree with you, but I feel like there's some talking points out there that need to be rebutted. So I'll try and do it very quickly.
Yes.
The first one is about that the indictment was in response to Trump running. Now, Michael Colangelo, who was the lead prosecutor, was hired 6 days after Trump declared he was running. That is true. But at that point in time, they'd already been preparing for this indictment for months. So the preparations began before Trump announced. That's the first thing. Second thing, Michael Colangelo himself, the prosecutor, there's been a lot of talk about how he came from the Biden Department of Justice. He was the number 3 officer in the Department of Justice. That's true. But before then, he was working with Alvin Bragg. Yeah. They were buddies, and what were they doing? They were going after Trump together. So, of course, Alvin Bragg got the band back together when he went after Trump. That's not about Biden dispensing some henchman. He was paid the same amount as he was in the DOJ. So, and for people to say that's a demotion, I mean, maybe technically, but let me ask you, how much did you hear of Colangelo before this trial compared to during this trial? I'd say that's a promotion.
Yeah. What about the judge Merchant? The donation to the Democrats' campaign. It was only $35.
I know.
15 of it went to Biden, but this is explicitly prohibited for a judge.
Yeah, look. To be honest, that is actually the thing that bothers me the most. I'm not worried about Bragg. I'm not worried about Colangelo, but the judge. To be clear, judges can take small amounts of donations in America. For instance, Eileen Cannon, the Florida judge at the moment, she gave $100 to Ron DeSantis. And also Judge Shutkin in Washington, she's the one in charge of the January 6 trial. She gave money to Obama. So they can, but I hate it. I don't like. Yeah, I agree. I don't like that at all. Let me ask you though, on the polling, we played a bit of polling before. Do you think this hurts Trump at all in the long run? Or in fact, do you think it helps Trump maybe? Republicans are saying that Eric Trump said that this won Trump the election.
Yeah, well, it's certainly seen a lot of donations go into his coffers. It literally broke the server at one point. Look, I think a couple of points to make. Firstly, there's a long way to go before the election, right? This, as you pointed out with those polls a week later, look, it may have moved a few people, maybe significantly. We don't know. In November, we might not even remember this current scandal. I mean, so much is going to happen, right? It's Donald Trump in the race here. The one thing I'd say, I guess, thematically as sort of a vibe thing is, having lived in the United States in 2020 when Trump lost, when he lost, there was a little bit of a sense of quiet, calm. You know, the noise of 4 years of Donald Trump, wall-to-wall Trump show, was switched off. And I sensed, I was admittedly living in Washington, DC, but there was a sense of relief there. And I've always thought it was a fairly high bar for Trump to sort of clear, to convince people to turn that volume dial right back up again. And I think what this trial will do, and remember we've got the sentencing to come, we've got other court cases and investigations lined up in the pipeline, it could remind people on polling day, you know, there's a lot of noise that comes with Trump. Those people in the middle that aren't rusted on at either end, do I really want that back in my life?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Look, I think I agree with you about what matters is how he plays it. Like, because this moment, it will be gone. As you said, it will be forgotten. I know it's hard to believe now, but it will be forgotten in a month's time, or in 6 months, 6 weeks' time, or 2 months' time, because it'll be another story, story. But how he plays it might go on for months and months and months. And if how he plays it is in an annoying way, it might remind people of what they forgot from 4 years ago.
And it's important how Biden plays it too, right?
So absolutely. Well, I mean, look, I think Biden has generally played it pretty well so far, and he hasn't been too triumphant. He hasn't been doing too much convicted felon gear, but he actually dropped his guard for one moment, and I think that might haunt him. I'll show you the moment I'm talking about.
Mr. President, can you tell us, sir, Donald Trump refers to himself as a political prisoner and blames you directly. What's your response to that, sir? Do you think the conviction will have an impact on the campaign?
Now, I don't know what he was thinking then. I don't know if he just couldn't think of an answer or if he didn't hear them properly or what. But whatever he was thinking, it was the wrong thing, because that smile, whatever it meant, is now going to be used on attack ads forever, like this one.
This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent.
Mr. President, can you tell us, sir, Donald Trump refers to himself as a political prisoner and blames you directly. What's your response to that, sir?
And so now it's got the spooky music treatment. Now,
His smile can say so much.
I mean, the fact that that's all they've got, though, shows that he's actually been doing pretty well.
Yeah.
Like, they've been sweating on a moment to take, and that's the best they've got, right?
Yeah.
But like you said, in terms of Trump, how he's been playing it, I think is also important. So far, I mean, he can make a noise at the moment. It's more going forward. In particular, I'm thinking about the convention being 4 days after sentencing.
Yep.
If his convention is hijacked by the sentencing, that might be bad news for him in terms of annoying people at home.
That's right.
And on that note, in terms of like the way these things are hanging together, he's still under a gag order, and he's been petitioning to try and get that gag order removed, at least for the debate, because at the moment the debate is going to come before sentencing. So it could be an absurd situation where he can't defend himself the way he wants to defend himself in a debate. So what's your view about that? Should the gag order be lifted?
I think the gag order is completely silly at this time. I mean, there's a few reasons that they say the gag order is in place. Number one, to protect the juries, from any prejudice, from any sort of being swayed by what Trump might say outside court. Well, the jury's gone, the conviction's in. The other is to kind of protect the broader perception of the administration of justice. But I'd argue, like, putting a gag order, that's going to have an impact on perception of justice. Putting a gag order on the leading candidate for the Republicans, and particularly in a debate, what he's not allowed to defend himself, that to me just seems it does start to smell like some sort of political interference or something, being slapped on him that I don't think is going to improve the system or the perception of the system of justice in the American people's minds.
I completely agree. I think there was a time for the gag order. It's come and gone. Yep. Let's move on.
Yeah, well, let's move on too. And indeed, the presidential campaign rolls on. We've got a big hint this week about one of the biggest remaining questions of the race, the shortlist for Donald Trump's vice presidential pick, although it actually wasn't that short because according to multiple reports citing multiple sources, the Trump campaign asked for personal information from more than a half dozen possible vice presidential picks. J.D. Vance, Doug Burgum, Tim Scott, Byron Donalds, Elise Stefanik, Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton and Ben Carson are all apparently in the mix. But Trump's campaign has emphasised anyone claiming to know who or when President Trump will choose his VP is lying unless the person is named Donald J. Trump. So let's ignore that advice entirely and take a stab at when and who Donald Trump is going to pick. Chaz, what do you reckon?
Oh, this is doomed. Okay, all right. Well, what I'll say is this. I'll say that he doesn't need someone to win him votes. Okay, he wins his own votes. So what he wants from a vice president, he wants someone who is going to say yes in January 6, 2028, whatever he asks them to do, he wants them to say yes this time.
Unquestioning loyalty.
Absolutely, that's what he wants. And most of that list, I think, are all pretty much bootlickers, so that's fine. The second thing he wants is someone who can actually win the 2028 election, because he will know from this first term, if you lose the next election, your entire legacy is wiped out immediately in 6 months, whereas you can consolidate it if there's another term after you. Now, out of that list, I would say my personal view are the people who are most likely to be able to win an election are J.D. Vance and Tim Scott. So I'd say if I was him, I'd pick one of them. But yeah, I'm not him.
Yeah,
what about you?
Looking at those two, J.D. Vance, loyalty, absolutely. As, at the court case, all the rest. I think Trump would be thinking somewhat about whether a candidate, a VP pick, is going to help him electorally. So J.D. Vance, great with white American disgruntled men. Well, Trump's kind of got that in spades. Tim Scott, I reckon, is pretty interesting because obviously you would imagine to help with the black vote. Remembering that Biden, he won, he scraped through in 2020 because of that vote. And every vote he gains from the black community, he takes from Joe Biden. And as for, unquestioning loyalty, I think we've seen a lot of that from Tim Scott lately. And I was watching quite carefully, Trump was on Newsmax a few nights ago, and he gave Tim Scott quite an endorsement. Have a look.
I thought Tim Scott didn't run as good a race as he's capable of running for himself. But as a surrogate for me, he's unbelievable. He's been incredible.
So he said, as a surrogate for me, he is incredible. He is unbelievable, he said. Quite an endorsement. I think more than that, though, he's really broadcasting to the world, and particularly Tim Scott. Mate, if you want this, you're going to have to get used to this sort of treatment. You're going to have to get used to playing second fiddle and me very publicly saying, Tim Scott, jump, and you jumping exactly when and where I say to do it.
Yeah, it looks like Tim enjoys jumping, so this might be the answer. He's very charismatic. He's a great campaigner. I think he could win the next election in 2028. So maybe he's the one. So it looks like, Don, you don't need to make a decision. We've made it for you. It's Tim Scott. So there you go. You can thank us later. You asked when.
Yep.
I don't know what Trump's going to do, but I'll tell you from my point of view, it's a no-brainer, which is there's, 4 days between the sentencing of Trump's conviction and the convention. He's going to want to get sentencing off the headlines as soon as he possibly can. This is a great way to do it, to drown it out. Also, if you push it back as far as possible, he can spin out the reality show, What Will He Do, which he loves to do so much. So I reckon in that 4-day period before the convention.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, at the convention, I guess, is the official unveil, but obviously it's, almost certainly you'd imagine it would leak out some sort of way. Maybe he'll make a full public pronouncement, but I totally agree with you on that one. Yeah.
All I would say is, whoever it is, even if it's not Tim Scott, I would say, I just hope it's not Marco Rubio. For Marco Rubio's sake. And the reason for that is because you can't have two people on the ticket from the same state.
Yes, one of them will have to move.
And guess which one's going to be?
Not going to be Trump.
The guy who's lived there his entire life. So just for Marco Rubio's dignity, I hope it's not him.
Very good point.
Before we leave the VPs, though, a few weeks ago, I did cite a rumour about Tim Scott from the New Republic. it might be all for naught, I'm afraid, Marco, because this week Trump gave a pretty massive hint as to his VP pick when he posted that one of the debates, quote, would take place at an HBCU on behalf of the future Vice President of the United States. HBCU stands for Historically Black College or University. In other words, Trump's suggesting that Tim Scott is going to be his VP pick. Well, I made a real schoolboy error there because I did not follow the links. Hey! And if I had, I would have seen that the New Republic was full of it. Trump actually posted that he accepted the Fox vice presidential debate. He wanted it to be at the Historically Black College or University, and that was it. There were no hints there at all. In fact, he explicitly said he had not yet chosen his VP. So that's my bad, I'm afraid. But on to making more mistakes. Now to today's focus topic, immigration. We spoke to you a few weeks back about how encounters on the southern border under Biden had shot up over the last few years, but they were beginning to subside a little in the last few months. We told you that reduction in border encounters you see at the end there was largely because of a crackdown on migrants by the Mexican government, how they'd used military patrols and highway checkpoints to intercept roughly 8,000 US-bound migrants per day. Now that's all welcome, but still leaves America with a staggering queue of 3.5 million people waiting for an immigration court date. 1.3 million of those are theoretically emergency asylum claims, and there are only 682 immigration judges to deal with all of that. And even now, there's still too many people entering the system to process them all. Well, this week we saw the inevitable result of when an immigration processing system becomes overloaded. There was news breaking that since 2022, more than 350,000 asylum cases have been closed by the US government if the applicants aren't deemed a threat to the country. That means while they're not granted or denied asylum, they're removed from the legal system and they can legally, indefinitely roam the US, effectively letting them slip through the cracks in some kind of legal limbo. Then, a few days later, finally a response from the Biden administration in the form of a new executive order.
Today I'm announcing actions to bar migrants who cross our southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum.
The order essentially states that if the number of border encounters passes a cap of 2,500 per day, which it is currently well past, the country enters a restricted state where only a few asylum applications will be considered, those made with official appointments through an app. Almost all the other applications will be rejected until the number of migrant encounters falls below 1,500 a day. And just to put that in context, America hasn't gotten close to that level of migrants since the pandemic. See that dotted line? That's the level, way below where they're at. Now, this is an interesting development because Biden has spent the last 3 years saying that his hands are tied on immigration unless he gets new powers from Congress. This is him a few months ago.
Is there more you can do? Absent
Not all I can do. Just give me the power. I've asked for the very day I got in office. Give me the border patrol. Give me the people the judges.
I curse the day they invented helicopters, but now he's just on his own decided to use that exact authority that Congress has told him he's had all along. In fact, it's the same legal authority that Trump tried to use back in 2019. Section 212F of the Immigration Act. That says whenever the president finds the entry of migrants would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may suspend the entry of all migrants or impose any restrictions on the entry of migrants that he may deem to be appropriate. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Except maybe Biden was right, because as soon as Trump tried to use that law, a federal court judge blocked Trump's order, saying it broke the Refugee Act. The Refugee Act states any migrant who is physically present in the United States or who arrives in the United States, irrespective of their status, may apply for asylum. So Biden might also be about to run into that buzzsaw. Well, this is all very complicated, so I spoke earlier again to one of the few people who can explain this kind of stuff, friend of the show and senior fellow at the American Immigration Council, Dara Lind. Dara Lind, welcome back to the Fireside Chat.
Thanks, it's good to be back.
Okay, so let's be clear about what this executive order actually does. If entries hypothetically were to never go above the 2,500 encounter cap and they were going to stay there below 2,500 encounters, would there be any rule changes then, or would the process stay exactly the same as it was before?
When it's not in a triggered state, then it's exactly the same as it was before this order went into effect. It's just that there have been so few times since, say, 2019 that you haven't had an average of 2,500 people crossing every day, that it's hard to predict that you would have a return to normalcy, if you will.
Okay, so let's say we hit the 2,500 encounter cap now, which we have, and the restrictions kick in. What exactly does that mean? Who is automatically rejected and who has the ability to still get through?
So no one is automatically rejected per se. People who enter the US between ports of entry, which is, your typical illegal crossing, present yourself to Border Patrol, are for the most part ineligible to receive asylum at the end of the process. They're still allowed to get lesser forms of other ways that the government can protect them instead of deporting them back to a place where they would be persecuted. There are also exemptions for, say, unaccompanied children are still eligible for full asylum. People who present themselves at ports of entry using the government's app for making asylum appointments are still eligible. And there are a few other exceptions built into that. But for the most part, there's this presumption of ineligibility for asylum seekers.
Now, there's a subtle change in the fine print here I want to ask you about. You used to get protected if you had a reasonable possibility of persecution. Now I believe you need to show, under the new system, that you have a reasonable probability of persecution. How much of a real-life difference does that single word change make?
That's a tremendously good question that we are still waiting to find out kind of how it plays out on the ground, because the government just invented this new screening standard. This is, to be clear, for being allowed to make a full claim for protection in the US. It's a screening interview and you either pass it or fail, and they've just raised the standard for passing. But they invented this entirely new reasonable probability standard and then just asserted straight up, oh, this is significantly higher than the standard was. You can't just say that. How that ends up working out is going to be determined by how the actual asylum officers interpret the rule, how the immigration judges interpret the rule. And so we're gonna see over the coming months whether this results in meaningfully lower passage rates, which is really the only way to tell whether it's meaningfully different.
And I know the administration says that those processed who fail to demonstrate a credible fear will be deported in a matter of days, if not hours. Have they provided any extra resources for deporting all those people? And if not, how is that possible?
They have not provided any extra resources for deporting people. Furthermore, there was an expectation that this announcement was going to come with an expanded deal with Mexico to expel some people back to Mexico, since that's much easier and cheaper for the government than deporting everyone back to their home countries, but that hasn't materialized. So we're looking at a situation in which a government that currently has the resources to detain and deport a pretty small fraction of border crossers is suddenly saying that it's going to have the resources to detain and deport all of them. And there are certainly a lot of questions about the extent to which that can be implemented at all and what it's going to look like when it presumably inevitably fails to live up to those expectations.
This just gets more and more complicated because, as you said, there is also an app, the CBP1 app, which allows about 1,450 people to make formal processing appointments every single day. Are those people counted towards the 2,500 encounter cap? And does the app keep taking 1,450 people a day, even in a restricted state?
No and yes, respectively. And this is really important. Unlike efforts previously to shut down asylum both at ports of entry and between ports of entry, the Biden administration is saying, look, we're letting you get asylum. You just have to come, quote unquote, the right way. You have to come to an official border crossing and you have to have an appointment. Now, those 1,450 people a day, that's a very, very small fraction of the people who are seeking appointments. We're still looking at, wait times for appointments that are measured in months. So there's definitely, it's not that they're, free to accommodate anybody who wants to step forward, but it does mean that, if you're really, really have your heart set on getting asylum per se and not on getting a lesser form of relief, you can just keep refreshing the app and wait till an appointment appears.
All right. So when these restrictions are in place, possibly permanently, is the app the only difference between this and Trump's policy back in 2018?
The app is certainly the major difference. There's also just, you can tell the differences between the two administrations by the way they write regulations, right? This one has a whole lot of complicated extra steps about here is exactly what has to happen in order for you to get some form of deportation protections. The Trump ban was just a lot blunter. That can actually make a difference if we're talking about whether federal judges are going to uphold the policy or not. So it's not totally a cosmetic difference. But in terms of, the meat of it, yeah, it uses the same provision of U.S. immigration law, and it takes the same population, with the exception of unaccompanied children who are exempted under Biden and not under Trump. And it says you cannot get asylum in the United States.
Now, a lot of people are saying this is all 100% illegal under current law. Do you agree that this is going to immediately be struck down?
Here in the US, there's become this kind of like savvy, cynical assumption that it's going to get held up in court very quickly, if not immediately. And, with some critics of the Biden administration saying that that's what the Biden administration intends. I've seen enough immigration policies go into effect to know that it's actually very hard to get a lawsuit up and running while a policy is already in effect. And it's also hard to get the policy to be stopped after you filed the lawsuit. So I'm not really sure that we're going to see the court stepping in a matter of days, which I think is what a lot of people just kind of quietly expect. I'm also not sure that courts are going to step in at all. This is a different, we do have a different tenor of the federal courts than there existed under Trump. At this point in the Trump administration, at the point in the Trump administration when he instituted his asylum ban, the federal courts were just very fed up with the amount of they weren't even paying lip service to going through the proper steps to make federal policy. And you could really see that in the court orders coming back to them. That isn't the case under the Biden administration. And the federal judiciary itself has changed. And so I would not, if I were a betting person, lay money on one side or the other of this getting held up.
Okay, let's say Biden actually pulls it off. Let's say it's legal and it works. What would be the consequences of this in the real world? Would there be lots of unaccompanied minors crossing officially, and unofficially lots of gotaways trying to avoid authorities?
That's an extremely good question. And what you're raising are absolutely two possibilities, because we know that this is a responsive system, right? People hear word of mouth, they respond to incentives, smugglers respond to incentives. When we talk about this policy working, the Biden administration has been pretty open that they define working not just as, this policy holds up in court, but they can deport a lot of people now and have fewer people coming in future. That requires not just, everything on the US side of the border working, but it also requires things to, change in the rest of the hemisphere, or, for Mexico, for example, which has been doing a lot to interdict migrants over the last few months, to keep doing that kind of work, to, prevent, to make sure that nothing else happens in this hemisphere that might cause another massive cascading refugee crisis. There are just so many other factors involved that it's hard to predict what exactly a post-asylum ban regime would look like, other than to say that it's not going to be quite as simple as nobody ever comes to the border anymore and asks for asylum.
Finally, Dara, there was a news story earlier this week about how since 2022, more than 350,000 asylum cases were just closed by the US government, as in people who were in the country and in the system suddenly had their cases just closed. What happens to those people? Do they just hang around indefinitely with no means of gaining asylum or legal status? And how much of a problem is that?
It's a problem insofar as it's a really good illustration of how this serves nobody, right? Like, is it, meaningfully changing the number of people who are in the US without status, or who, depending on how the cases are closed, some of them do have work permits, some of them do not. Like, that's not itself changing the US labor market or anything. But what it says is the US government is committed to continuing to throw people, or to push people into this pipeline that is so jammed that the pipeline is exploding down the process, and people are just ending up getting lost. It's absolutely a problem for the asylum seekers themselves, because they're in the US, but they're in limbo. In some cases, they're being told that they should not, even if they think they have a really, really strong asylum claim, they should not turn around and apply for asylum with US Citizenship and Immigration Services, that they're not allowed to do that they're just kind of out of options. And it's a problem for the government, which is, on the one hand, telling people, we promise if you come to the US, you'll be deported in a matter of days, as you said. And on the other hand, quietly having all of these people not only not deported, but have no consequences levied upon them at all.
Dara Lind, thank you so much for visiting us one more time for a Fireside Chat.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was a lot to take in, David. Do you think that this will solve either Biden's policy problem or his political problem with immigration?
Look, possibly neither, I'd say, because it smacks to me, really, doesn't it, of a policy announcement without any prospect of a policy outcome. And that's because, quite frankly, it's just not going to work, right? So you look at all of those things that you just talked about in that interview, the court challenges, that even if he surpasses them, he doesn't have the resources, the infrastructure to actually deport that many migrants. If he had that, well, he's got to convince countries like Venezuela to take back these migrants. Yes. That's not going to happen. He would have to lean on Mexico as a result to take them. If that all goes through, well, the migrants are probably just going to attempt to cross the border once again and keep trying again and again and again until they get across. So, look, I don't see this is going to work. I guess the one thing it gives him, and it's a small thing, is it gives him the opportunity, because he would know that it's not going to work, to at least say to the American people, I tried everything I could. I tried through Congress. The Republicans wouldn't let me. I tried with an executive order. The courts wouldn't let me. I gave it a crack. I don't know. Is that going to fly?
Don't know about that. Look, I want to reinforce something you just said, which is that it's not going to work. And I want to give you one more reason why it's not going to work. We've been here before. And when we were here was during COVID. There was a period where they shut down the border entirely, pretty much. And I'll show you what happened. What happened was, if you can't come legally, people come illegally. Have a look at these gotaways. The gotaways are the people who get past without being intercepted. And they shot up during COVID. Even under Trump, they shot up. And as soon as the immigrants could come through legally again, the gotaways went down again. So if you stop them coming legally, successfully, they're just going to come illegally, and that's what's going to happen. And then the migrants will be here anyway, but you just won't have any track of who they are, which in a way is even worse.
So do you think he had an opportunity during COVID to actually get on top of this?
You've read my mind. I actually think this is entirely Biden's fault, because he had a golden period of 12 months where the numbers were relatively low, when he could have experimented with trying new strategies, trying to resource up, because the problem now is they don't have enough resources. Exactly. They could have trained more judges. They could have built more camps. They could have undertaken construction to try and fix this situation, but they did nothing. And then for 2 years he sat on it and did nothing. And now in the last 6 months there's panic moves everywhere. Yeah. It's too little, too late.
Yeah, it's not going to cut it. Well, moving on now to some unsettling developments out of Europe this week as the Ukraine war grinds on. The Biden administration has given the green light for Ukraine's forces to use American weapons to strike inside Russian territory. Now, this is something that President Biden has firmly resisted since the start of the war. In fact, he previously said any attack on Russian territory risked violating his mandate to, quote, avoid World War III. Now, the White House insists the authorisation is strictly limited to acts of self-defence to protect the city of Kharkiv from missiles, glide bombs and artillery shells from just over the border. But Russia's President Vladimir Putin said the development could mark America's direct involvement in the war against the Russian Federation. And he reserved the right to act in the same way by providing Russian weapons, potentially, to strike out at Western targets. Chaz, I don't know about you, but on this spectrum, I am pretty firmly in the anti-World War III camp.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of World War III either. But I think Biden's problem, just to take a step back, I think his problem with foreign policy is that he's a little bit too worried about World War III. And what I mean by that is that if everyone knows that you're very nervous about what they're going to do, they take advantage of that. Now, if we go back to Trump for a second, I don't think he was some foreign policy guru, but one advantage that he had was everyone was scared about what he was going to do. They weren't sure if he was bluffing or if he was not bluffing, and so they played it safe. Now we have the opposite, where Biden is worried about what everyone else is going to do. He's worried about Putin. Is Putin bluffing? Is Iran bluffing? Is Hamas bluffing? He's worried about everyone else bluffing, and so he plays it safe. And we have this absurd situation where even though America is the most powerful country in the world, they're pussyfooting around worrying about everyone else. Like, America's worried about Iran. Iran should be worrying about America. And the other thing I'd say is that if you're going to do that, and that's fine. I like people not playing games and not bluffing. That's fine. But then you just need to stick by your word. What you need to do then is you need to have some kind of certainty, because especially if you're the strongest dog in the pack, you need to say, okay, when you draw a line and you say don't do this, you need to stand by. If they do this, keep moving it. If they do something, there's consequences. Whereas you take, say, the Houthis, for example, when they were bombing ships in the Gulf, Biden said don't do that, and then they'd bomb another ship. No, don't do that, and then they bomb another ship. And it was like the 12th chance before Biden responded. I think if Biden doesn't want to play games, he just needs to have certainty. He needs to have absolute strength in what he says. Otherwise, he just looks weak. And I feel at the moment, Biden is being pushed around and taken advantage of by other people. And I think this story is a great example where Putin knows if he tweaks Biden, Biden's gonna cringe a little bit, and that's not a great situation. Yeah, well, it's not a great situation, and I guess more broadly what worries me, speaking of red lines and Putin, I mean, what's his red line? He's always threatening nuclear war. He's always sort of invoking that. You know, we don't know what he's going to do. He's inherently unpredictable, and how's this going to play out? And I think for Ukraine, I mean, the fact that this is now considered needed, and that the United States considers that Ukraine needs to be able to strike into Russian territory, I mean, to me, that's a bit of a worrying sign for Ukraine's ability to sort of withhold Russia going forward. You know, that line does keep moving, that it does keep pushing on. So, I mean, a lot of reasons this does sort of worry me about the broader situation of what's happening in that part of the world. Yeah, I suppose all I'd say as well is that we shouldn't overplay what this is. That's true. Because Ukraine have been using their own weapons inside Russia the whole time. It's just American weapons we're talking about here. And also, it's not use our weapons to do whatever you like, it's use our weapons to respond to imminent threats. That's right. So, but it is still American weapons, you know. So, and as Putin pointed out, you know, this in his eyes is direct involvement by the United States in the war. So, you know, you would hope that the lid stays on those restrictions, right? On that, we can agree.
Landing a man.
It's Tuesday, September the 23rd, 1952. 6:30 p.m. on America's West Coast, 9:30 in the East. Around 60 million Americans tune their TVs and radios into a broadcast that will change American history.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency.
42 days before the US presidential election, Senator Richard Nixon's political career is on the line because he's also
the man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned.
39-year-old Nixon is the running mate of General Dwight Eisenhower, and they are the Republican Party's best hope of winning the White House in 20 years.
To me, the office of the Vice Presidency of the United States is a great office. And I feel that the people have got to have confidence in the integrity of the men who run for that office and who might obtain it.
However, Nixon's integrity is very much in doubt, and so is his place on the Republican ticket. Press reports revealed wealthy Nixon supporters in California have been contributing to a fund established after he won his Senate seat in 1950 to help cover travel and office expenses. Aides urged Eisenhower to end the scandal and dump Nixon. Sitting behind a television desk in a studio built for variety television shows, Nixon tells his viewers that the $18,000 fund was neither illegal nor immoral, and that his donors had not received any special favours.
Not 1 cent of the $18,000 or any other money of that type ever went to me for my personal use. Every penny of it was used to pay for political expenses that I did not think should be charged to the taxpayers of the United States.
Nixon then went into unprecedented detail about his upbringing, education, war service and modest circumstances, comparing it to the wealth of some of his political rivals. With his wife Pat sitting uneasily to one side, he disclosed his income, loans for his car, other debts and even the value of his life insurance.
Well, that's about it. That's what we have, and that's what we owe. It isn't very much, but Pat and I have the satisfaction that every dime that we've got is honestly ours.
And here's why Pat was sitting there.
I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything.
And if that wasn't laying it on thick enough, then came this.
One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too. We did get something, a gift, after the election.
A gift? Golly jeepers, Mr. Nixon, what was it?
You know what it was?
Oh, Jiminy Crickets, tell me!
It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas.
Someone sent you a dog in a crate on a train from Texas? That's a bit weird. Okay, what did it look like?
Black and white, spotted. And our little girl Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers.
The dog's name was Checkers.
And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
Still, Richard Nixon left that studio convinced that he'd flopped. He'd asked viewers to write their support into the Republican Party, but he ran out of time and he wasn't able to give out the address. But still, tens of thousands of cards and letters poured in. What immediately became known as the Checkers speech saved Nixon's spot on the Eisenhower ticket and his career. In November, Eisenhower and Nixon won in a landslide. After 8 years as vice president, Nixon lost a close contest for the White House against John F. Kennedy, but finally reached the presidency in the election of 1968. But 6 years later, Richard Nixon would resign in ultimate disgrace over the Watergate cover-up, and this time, no Cocker Spaniel could save him.
Now, before we go, one more addition to the show of endless corrections. Unfortunately, we haven't had the time to get to these lately because there's been so much news. But a few weeks back, we were talking about a strange bit of performance art from Trump.
Then, oddly, some somber music started up and Trump stopped. Maybe the teleprompter got stuck, but the self-proclaimed frickin' genius just stood there, shaking his head for a full 35 seconds before he started up again.
But now, we are a nation in decline.
Well, a lot of people made fun of Trump for that moment, including Biden's campaign team, and it really peeved Trump off. He wrote, "The Biden campaign put out a fake story that I froze for 30 seconds, going into the musical interlude section, when in actuality, the 30 to 60-second period of silence is standard in every one of my speeches where we use the music. Check out any of my speeches." So I did. And shiver me timbers, he was right. This is Trump in Greensboro, shaking his head ruefully. This is Trump in Laconia. And this is Trump in Waco. There are heaps of these, actually. He does it a lot, presumably to express his disappointment about the state of the nation. I still find it weird.
Yeah, that's weird.
But the fact is, we and a whole lot of media were wrong about that, so sorry.
Well, that's it for tonight's Fireside Chat. John Barron, of course, will be back for Planet America next Wednesday.
And you can watch the show on iView, YouTube and Facebook. And don't forget to PEP as a Planet Extra podcast and all the usual pod places. See you there.
Bye-bye.